Hi, this is the second in a series of videos I'm doing going through philosophy from at least one Christian perspective, mine. Of course, that's something that we will reckon with as we go through these videos, and that is that as clearly as I may think I am thinking, I am stuck within my head. I cannot see myself, and I cannot see the world clearly. I see the world through a glass darkly, as 1 Corinthians 13 suggests. However, I can give you a thesis to which you can antithesis, and maybe we'll come up with a synthesis. I'm going to divide up the field of logic. So one branch of philosophy is called epistemology. Epistemology deals with the question of truth and of knowledge. How do we know that we know what we think we know? Probably in this series of videos, we'll get to some of the deeper questions of epistemology near the end, because they tend to be more abstract and also the kinds of things that drive a certain personality crazy. However, I do want to begin with some basics of logic, and I'm going to treat logic in two different installments. First, I want to talk about truth in general, some basics about how to know whether something's true or not. And then I'll do a second video on logical fallacies, or bad thinking, as it were. Okay, it is conventional to speak of three tests for truth. The first one has come under some fire because of postmodernism, and it relates to what we might call the correspondence test. Is this cup here? Well, the question of whether this cup is here asks whether the correspondence test asks, does it correspond to the data? So there is light reflecting off of this into my eyes, at least that's the way we talk about it. And so I have evidence in my sight. I have evidence, now you have some evidence of sight, but I have evidence of touch personally, because my hand is touching it, which suggests it's here. Now I can smell it a little. My wife has a much better sense of smell than I do, but I can smell that this is coffee, and so I have evidence from my olfactory, glands. I can't really say so. Touch, taste. Okay. I didn't know. Here. Okay, I have evidence from my taste. So, does the truth claim that there's a cup here correspond to the data? That's the correspondence test. Now, of course, I could be sleeping, I suppose, although, now when you're sleeping, you don't usually know you're sleeping, but right now I'm pretty sure I'm not sleeping. That doesn't mean it's true, but it feels like I'm awake. So, the correspondence test, there can be, there could be, in the future, I'm sure there'll be very realistic holograms, if we don't blow each other up. This is not an absolute kind of thing. It's not for sure, but there's a distinction between whether it's true and my apprehension of that truth. The correspondence test is our primary way of assessing truth. If I say, hey, there's a car accident out front, you go to the front door and you look. My father played an April Fool's joke on me when I was a teenager once, saying that somebody hit our car out in front in the night, and of course, being the person I am, I went out front immediately to try to find it, and April Fools. But I was able to assess the truth of what my dad had said by going outside and looking, and the outside did not correspond to what he'd said. So inductive thinking, or scientific thinking, it goes from my observations. I observe stuff, I form hypotheses, I go back and test the hypotheses. If it seems to work enough, then I form a theory. Inductive thinking does not tend to be final thinking, in the sense that I might always find new data that overthrows my hypothesis. But evidentiary thinking is another way of talking about it. Evidentiary thinking seems to work pretty well. It is the way we get through the world for the most part. A second test is the coherence test. So the coherence test asks whether the truth claim holds together or does it contradict itself. Something can't be both A and not A at the same time. Now I realize that there are paradoxes, and there are, you can say things in a way that it sounds like it's both A and not A. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about things that are mutually exclusive. So, and you're using words in the same way. A lot of times when two contradictory things are both true, you're using one of them in a slightly different way than the other one, or you're speaking metaphorically. So, am I sitting in this chair or am I not sitting in this chair? In the normal way of talking, it's either true or false. Either I'm sitting in this chair or I'm not sitting in this chair. Now you could say, well, Ken's body's here, but his mind is somewhere else. But then you're not using words in the same way. Then you're saying Ken's not here today, but you're not talking literally. Then you're speaking metaphorically. My body is here. So the coherence test again seems to hold throughout the universe. Something cannot both be A and not A if A and not A are mutually exclusive. If they're true opposites, they can't both be true at the same time. Now I realize there's quantum stuff and so forth, but we're talking about ordinary kinds of things in life. Now even with quantum things, right now in quantum theory and quantum mechanics, there are formulas that work, but they don't work all the time. There are aspects to the quantum world where there's incoherence there. But I think most physicists today would claim that eventually we will arrive at a grand unified theory where it all coheres. In other words, there aren't that many physicists today who would say, yes, these two theories contradict quantum mechanics and general relativity contradict each other. Celebrate, no. There is a sense that there will, at some point, be some brilliant mind or minds that will find a way for these two theories to cohere with each other. They cohere in nature, right? In a black hole somehow successfully combines quantum mechanics and general relativity. The fact that we don't know how to do that in our scientific myths, as it were, we don't know how to express how those two fit together, doesn't mean that they can't be fit together. And eventually, of course, I believe science will find a way to combine those two theories. We just haven't gotten there yet. And so the coherence test, again, is a test for truth that has worked throughout history. And so here we're talking about deductive thinking. If this assumption is true, then these deductions necessarily follow. No, that's just the way it is. This is true. And by the way, I don't think that this is cultural. I don't think that logic is something cultural. Now, the expression of logic can be cultural. The application, the way we talk about it, there are different ways to talk about logic, true. But the rules of logic seem to be intrinsic to the universe in the same way that the laws of physics are intrinsic to the universe. So force equals mass times acceleration is not cultural. Force equals mass times acceleration doesn't work differently in China than it works in Africa or in Asia. China is Asia, or in Europe. The laws of physics work the same everywhere. And so it would seem that the laws of logic work everywhere. There is a syllogism is a syllogism whether we're in Alpha Centauri or on Mars or Titan, or whether we're in Russia. The laws of the syllogism are part of universal truth. You jump off a cliff and you say, well, I don't want to go splat, and I don't believe I'm going to go splat. And in that sense, truth doesn't care. That is, when it comes to logic doesn't care where you're from or who your family is, doesn't care whether you're rich or poor. Logic is logic. It is like the laws of physics. If a syllogism is a syllogism is a syllogism. It doesn't matter that Aristotle came up with it, who was a Greek who lived in the 300s. The syllogism is true. You can express it in different ways, but a syllogism is a syllogism is a syllogism. Now, God created the universe out of nothing, and so I believe God created logic out of nothing. So I don't know whether logic applies to God when he's outside the universe, and perhaps God created another universe where there's a different kind of logic. That's above any of our pay grades. We couldn't. I can't even comprehend a different kind of logic. I don't know what that would even look like. However, if God created the universe out of nothing and created the rules of the universe, then I don't know what's true on God's time. But in this universe, the laws of logic seem to be created, part of the universe. They're not cultural. The expression of them may be cultural, but again, it doesn't matter what culture you're in. If you drive your vehicle at a pole, there's going to be certain consequences. And in the same way, logic seems to be transcultural. I can't imagine any way in which that's not the case. So the third test is the pragmatic test. And here's where postmodernism comes into play. Postmodernism basically raised questions about everything we're talking about here. Postmodernism raised questions about whether I can separate myself from what is true, and I can't. I'm stuck in my head. My perspective of the world is going to color everything, and I just have to deal with that. I have to have a certain epistemic humility about my knowledge because I'm stuck in this head. Postmodernism drew all sorts of questions about the tidy logic of the Enlightenment and so forth. But in the end, postmodernism is more of a spanking than a complete unraveling of these things, because the correspondence test and the coherence test work. They work really, really well. I believe this chair down here is real. That thought worked. Now, do I know for sure that there's a chair here? Maybe I don't. But it works. And so and here's the point, even from a postmodern perspective, the correspondence and coherent tests work. They work. I can't imagine anything else. Nothing else works like the correspondence test and the coherence test. And therefore, even from a postmodern perspective, let's get on with it. Okay, so the last thing I want to cover before finishing this video, and then I'll do another video on logical fallacies, is the syllogism, which was first kind of set out by Aristotle. But again, Aristotle discovered the syllogism. He did not invent the syllogism. It's not a matter of Greek culture, which, by the way, I'm not Greek. My wife is partially Greek, but I'm not Greek. I can't claim Aristotle. Aristotle's not in my lineage. There is no Western philosophy in a sense, because Aristotle is a guy that lived a long time ago before there was a Europe, and so Aristotle's Greek. He's not even European, because there's no Europe at the time of Greece. So Aristotle, I can't claim Aristotle as my culture, other than the fact that my culture has liked Aristotle, but my culture might decide it likes Buddha, next week. But can I claim Buddha? I mean, so what I'm saying here is this is not. I'm not claiming the syllogism as part of my culture. The syllogism is part of the universe that a guy in a different culture named Aristotle came up with or recognized in the 300s. Okay, so this is something like what a syllogism is. So a syllogism will have, say, a premise. A premise is a truth claim. All unmarried people are single. This is true by definition, right? This is not a matter of observation. This is a starting point. Almost all logic begins with certain axioms or presuppositions. When we boil all of our thinking down, our thinking comes down to certain presuppositions or assumptions, we might say definitions and so forth. So all unmarried people are single. This is a matter of definition. This is just how we define what single is. So it's true by definition. Premise B, Joe is unmarried. Now this is not a matter of definition. This is a matter of correspondence. This is a truth claim where I might go find out if Joe, now again, Joe might be hiding his wife somewhere. Maybe he's married in a different country, anyway. But so the truth claim here can be disputed. Premise A can't be disputed because it's a matter of definition. The second premise could be disputed because it's a matter of observation. But if both of these premises are true, then this conclusion must follow. There is no there's no possible world in this universe where this doesn't true. There's no culture where this is not true. The syllogism doesn't care. It is true. If all unmarried people are single, and that's true by definition, and if Joe is unmarried, then Joe is single. This is called logic. This is the syllogism. Again, it's not cultural. It's just what is. So that's what a syllogism is. Syllogism is deductive logic, where you start with certain assumptions and then you form a logical conclusion from there. Here's another example that I'll end this video with. So, the people to whom the books of the Bible were written mostly understood them. Now, I can't prove this, I suppose. I can't go find those people. But it seems fairly reasonable, right, that when Paul wrote the Thessalonians probably understood most of what he said. Or when Paul wrote the Corinthians, they probably understood most of what he said. Now, they may not have understood everything he said, of course, but they probably understood a lot of what he said because they have a common language, right? They both speak Greek. They both know each other. They kind of have a common set of references. So this seems possible or likely. Now, here's another one. The peoples of the Bible understood words based on their paradigms and language games. What am I saying here? Well, I'm saying that if God had inspired Paul to write in my categories, then probably the Thessalonians wouldn't have understood much of it. If God inspired Moses, to speak in the categories of 1800s Britain, then probably Israel wouldn't have understood what he was saying. So if the people understood, then and they would have understood it within their own paradigms, right? Because an ancient Israelite understands the world according to the way people in ancient Israel understand things, not the way people in modern USA understand things. So it seems fairly reasonable to assume that the peoples of the Bible understood their words based upon their particular frameworks. Now, their language games and paradigms were different from ours. Again, if you've ever been to another country or another culture for very long, you realize that people in other cultures, even here in the United States, where I'm at, somebody from a different subculture will understand things probably differently than I do. And so, the people to whom the books, they probably understood the books. They understood the books in terms of their own categories. Their categories are different from ours. Again, this is a correspondence test. We might try to figure that out. Here's the logical conclusion. Therefore, we have some distance to cover to understand these words. This is a logical sequence. Now, again, it's not as tight as the previous syllogism. We can dispute or qualify the premises, premise 1, premise 2, premise 3. We might qualify or nuance some of these, but the basic logic, it seems to me, is pretty sound. And it suggests that if God wanted the original audiences of the Bible to understand those books, then he would have spoken in their categories to a very large extent. But their categories seem to be somewhat different from mine in a number of respects. It's sometimes said that someone, say, from Africa would be more likely to understand the Old Testament by default than I would, because the culture of Africa is more similar to the culture of the Old Testament than my culture is to the Old Testament. Therefore, it logically follows that when we read the Bible, if we want to understand what it meant originally, there's going to be some distance between us and the text. That seems to follow logically. This is a more complex syllogism, but it gives you an example of what logic looks like. So, we're off to the races. This has been How to Think Clearly, Part 1.